we're going to start our last panel of the day. So this last panel focuses on identity, and we've got 4 very, very strong panellists here. But to begin with, I'm going to introduce your chair, Benno Gamel, who is from the University of Goldsmiths in London, and who focuses on queer histories. And can we just talk about the amazing programme at Goldsmiths on queer histories, which I saw and I kind of thought maybe it's too late to change now, but if I could, that's where I'd be.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this last and very exciting panel. I'm at the Center for Queer History at Goldsmiths, and I'm kind of mentioning this again because it also has to do kind of with I think of myself as a gay man. Is it not working? So I think of myself as a gay man. And when I turn to queer history, now it's working. All right. And when I started my oral history research on homosexualities and emotional life in West Germany, for me that was exactly kind of what all this day is about, right? To kind of bravely fight for the margins and to try to push them, to move them towards the center. But then, of course, I'm also very much aware of the problems that come with that kind of thinking and narrative, right? It's usually we think of it as a success story and kind of, women supposedly maybe made it, but often it's not that easy, right? You don't just move from the margins to the center and then, hey, there we are, all good. Sometimes the center has disappeared once you reach it. It moved elsewhere, or as we've already been discussing, it might have diversified, split up, I don't know. Stuff to think about. But we now want to think about these kind of questions, that relationship between centers, margins, with a focus on identity, identification, identity politics. And we do so from different perspectives. Actually, I think it's fantastic because kind of the papers we're going to listen to now do resonate with things that have been discussed and mentioned throughout the day. Actually, I think in very intriguing ways. You will see. What we are going to listen to are 4 papers. One on Quentin Crisp and questions around gay and trans and queer identities. One on artificial limbs, disability, and questions of forming an identity with a part of your body that was not always there, in a way. Then a paper on the Black Amour of Peter the Great and kind of bringing Black identities, people of color identities, to bear on Russian history. And a paper on drag and what it means for the self and for the self of our speaker as well. So that's kind of the range of things we're going to talk about. I will kind of introduce each speaker as we go along and the topic. And I was going to, after the papers, we're going to do a little bit of an experiment. I first came across that at a conference for queer archives and museums in Berlin this summer, where chairs asked the audience to actually engage in conversations with the people that's sitting next to them. So once we've heard the papers, I'm going to ask you kind of for 5 minutes also to engage in conversations with people you don't know, talk about what you've heard, what you found interesting, comments and questions might emerge from that, and then we can share these comments and questions in the discussion, in the Q&A towards the end of this session. So that's kind of the plan for the next 1.5 hours, roughly. And now, without further ado, we're going to go to the first paper, which is noticed that it's interesting in terms of center and margins, that the chairs are always sitting in the center. And then there's a range of margins to my right and to my left. So we're going to start with the speaker to my left side, who is Piers Haslam from Goldsmiths. So we do know one another. We're from the same institution. And Piers is a history student, and he will be talking about Quentin Crisp and what we can learn from his kind of her autobiographical reflections on identity and changing ways in which she identified across her life. And there you go. The floor is yours.
So I'm aware that some people here will be more familiar with Quentin Crisp than others, and there's probably a slight generational dimension to that. So I kind of, in my paper, I've kind of incorporated a bit of an introduction to who Quentin Crisp is, just because I don't think everyone might be familiar. So, from the publication of her autobiography, Quentin Crisp became one of the most prominent homosexuals in the British public eye. In The Naked Civil Servant, she used wit and dark humour to describe her life as a gender non-conforming person in London from the 20s to the 50s. This was then adapted into an acclaimed film starring John Hurt. In the 80s, after several new books and numerous television appearances, Quentin moved to New York. And through the 90s, as her health deteriorated, she dictated her final book, which she hoped would be an opportunity to, quote, have the last word, end quote. It's in the first chapters of this book that she gives us a revelation. At the age of 90, it has finally been explained to me that I am not really homosexual. I'm transgender. I now accept that. She goes on to apologise to her readers for this, and especially to the gay men who had taken her as an inspiration and an icon, saying that though she had led most of her life as a homosexual, she had done so in spite of her, quote, actual fate of being a woman trapped in a man's body, end quote. She adds that, quote, if it's confusing for you, think how confusing it's been for me these past 90 years, end quote. This paper was sparked by these revelations from The Last Word, which was published 18 years after Quentin's death. It considers these questions. What does Quentin's revelation tell us about gender and sexuality in 20th century Britain? Does it mean that, in some sense, Quentin was always trans? Relatedly, does Quentin's revelation suggest that other gender non-conforming homosexuals of her generation were also trans? And taking a step back from all this, does all of this suggest that trans histories have been marginalised in histories of homosexuality? I begin by setting some historiographical context before giving some examples from Quentin's life, which will help us to start thinking about these questions. Historians like Matt Holbrook have emphasised that understandings of queer identity are historically contingent, which makes it difficult to argue that contemporary modes of queerness mirror historical modes of queerness. In Holbrook's seminal book, Queer London, he asserts that the world mapped in this book is not a gay world as we would currently understand it. In Holbrook's schema, there were three types of queer men in interwar London. Key here for our purposes is Holbrook's first category, the effeminate queens. They were generally working class, mimicked normative feminine roles in their relationships, wore flamboyant clothes or drag, and often used feminine pronouns for each other. In the 20s and 30s, Quentin fitted quite comfortably into this effeminate queen category. Indeed, this is why I take inspiration from them in using she-her pronouns for Quentin. Some of the most vivid parts of The Naked Civil Servant describe the first time she broke away from her stolid suburban middle-class home, wandered the West End, and found the dilly boys, bitches and queens who made up such a prominent part of London's queer culture. At the Black Cat Cafe in Soho, Quentin wrote that, quote, day after uneventful day, night after loveless night, we sat buying each other cups of tea, combing each other's hair, and trying on each other's lipstick. Later in the book, Quentin describes another way that they would entertain each other. I and my friends acted out to each other the stories of the various pictures we had seen. I was still a devotee of the divine woman. In my lifetime, she changed her name 3 times, calling herself first Bridget Helm, later Greta Garbo, and finally Marlene Dietrich. I thought about her a great deal, wore her clothes, said her sphinx-like lines, and ruled her kingdom. As such, this part of Quentin's life is a testament to a very particular mode of queer identity in which sexual desire was inextricably linked to gender. Despite the trans resonances of Quentin's words, it's clear that, for most of her life, she was resigned to being a homosexual man. If we jump to the aftermath of the film version of The Naked Civil Servant, we find her expressing this in a television interview. The interviewer basically argues if she ever had a desire or has a desire to be a woman. To which Quentin responds, "Well, I suppose when I was a child, when I lived almost entirely in a dream world, I suppose I thought of myself as a woman. But later on you realise you have to live in the real world and that you are not a woman. You are only in some senses effeminate or feminine, and that you must make this compromise. You must learn to live in a world where statistically you are a man, whatever you may think about yourself." The words "later on you realise" suggest that there were times in Quentin's life when she thought of herself as, deep down, a woman. But by this time, she felt her inner feminine self was simply impossible to realise in the world. Perhaps this contented defeatism had hardened as the gendered framework of her identity became increasingly distasteful to a new generation of gay men. Just after the broadcast of the film in 1975, a man wrote to Gay News, a publication which could be seen as a cornerstone of 1970s liberation, and called her presence on the screen a 20-year setback. "As far as I'm concerned, being gay means that I am a perfectly normal human being with one slight difference. I prefer to love another man. I am not and see no point in trying to ape a female." Although tensions with more discreet homosexuals pervade her autobiography, by the 70s, the idea of a gendered dimension to homosexual identity was becoming less tolerated in gay politics and life. In this context, it's hardly surprising that Quentin was a bitter critic of gay liberation towards the end of her life, as it did not accommodate what we could, in modern terminology, call a trans identity. With these examples in mind, let's return to some of my opening questions. Does Quentin's revelation suggest that the queens of interwar London were also trans? I don't think this is accurate. Holbrook is correct that these identities do not map straightforwardly onto modern ones. Indeed, Holbrook gives examples of men who originally identified with this queen category, but who in the 60s and 70s drifted away from the gendered meanings of these identities and began to call themselves gay. What it does do, however, is give us a unique linkage between the interwar queens and trans people today. Unlike some others, Quentin never felt able to leave her sense of inner femininity behind, which led her to identify with transgender identity in the 1990s. Perhaps there were others like her. Does Quentin's revelation suggest that trans histories have been marginalised within histories of homosexuality? Clearly, there is much left to be desired from the histories which have been written. Before Holbrook, Quentin and the Queens were seen simply as gay men who used different words for themselves. Holbrook complicated this. But even in his work, their gender nonconformity is merely used to disturb the confidence of gay history. He does not comment upon the clear resonances of their identities with trans people today. Future historians must, then, look towards something new. The complications of identity in the past are such that a diverse range of queer people today might see themselves in Quentin and her friends. In her own life, she did not realise an identity which expressed her sense of an inner feminine self. For most of her life, she was a homosexual man, yet it seems she was also a woman. But the regrets she had just before her death show us that we can amplify the trans resonances of her life, perhaps making her story one which inspires not just gay men, or just trans women, or just non-binary people, but one which speaks to a shared queer history which is as confusing to us as Quentin's life was to herself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot to think about here, about identity conflicts as well, and kind of shifting identities along the margins. The next paper is presented to us by Carmen Hasketh, who is a student of history in Edinburgh, writing her dissertation actually on an another very interesting topic on kind of HIV histories and how they might be brought to the museum. But the paper today comes from another one of Commons projects, which is about disability artificial limbs and tracing the history of their usage in Scotland since the First World War. So the floor is yours. Very much looking forward.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me. Is this microphone working? Great. So this was actually a project I did over a 2-month internship last summer. So everything that you will see in this presentation is what I found through looking through an archive called the David Gow Archive, which is in the Lothian NHS archive at the University of Edinburgh. So I've got a few aims for this paper. So bioengineering is the design and construction of prostheses and disability living aids. This paper will outline a history of the industry in the Scottish city of Edinburgh, where upper limb prostheses have been constructed since the First World War. It will discuss the experiences of those who use prostheses, how the prostheses were used, and how the prostheses help to define their experiences and identities as disabled people. Overall, this paper will aim to signify that the history of bioengineering, though heavily under-researched, is an extremely meaningful area of study. And I'm first going to talk about a place called Eden Hall Hospital. Eden Hall Hospital moved to the area of Pinkyburn near Musselburgh, Lothian in 1918, because 3 years previously it was opened in Kelso in the Scottish borders. This hospital was created specifically to provide support to soldiers who had lost their limbs in the war effort, but it also had a workshop on site where soldiers were able to create prostheses for themselves. This was inspired by the prostheses design taking place in Roehampton, a limb fitting centre at Queen Mary's Hospital in London. The experiences of patients at Eden Hall during this period allowed us a small glimpse into the experiences of disabled people during the first half of the 20th century. With the exception of the patients and the nurses, no other individuals appear in the only known Eden Hall Hospital photo album. Perhaps this could be due in part to the fact that hospital visitors were not photographed, but this could also suggest that disabled people in the early 20th century experienced a significant degree of isolation from mainstream society. Perhaps the veterans' experiences as disabled people was also determined in part to their identity as men. Gender stereotypes during this period meant that men were expected to financially provide for the family as the breadwinner, which would be especially difficult for men who were still coming to terms with their disability as a result of the traumatic circumstances of warfare. However, contemporary photographs also show that patients in Eden Hall worked on their respective artificial limbs together, as we can see in this photograph, and they also worked on other craft projects as well, not just artificial limbs. This highlights that these men would have shared a common experience, creating a collective identity and a support work for one another. Furthermore, their artificial limbs were handmade, and thereby an expression of themselves as successful artificial limbs was have been tailored to their individual thought processes and movements. Therefore, life for disabled patients at Eden Hall Hospital may have been rather separate from everyday life in Scotland during the First World War and its immediate aftermath, but the construction of prostheses could have helped these men to accept their disability and create friendships with those in a similar situation. So now I'm going to go a bit forward into 1960s and talk a bit about the thalidomide tragedy. The thalidomide tragedy of the early 1960s brought the construction of artificial limbs to the fore of the national media and the NHS's agenda. A popular sleeping pill throughout Europe, thalidomide was also used among pregnant women for morning sickness. However, thalidomide was not tested for side effects during pregnancy, and as a result thousands of children were born with extreme limb deficiencies. In Scotland, around 150 children were impacted by thalidomide, and around 30 of these children suffered from extreme disability. In response, in 1963, the Power Prosthetics Unit, a small workshop funded by the Scottish Home and Health Department, was opened next to Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary Hospital. The unit, later renamed the Bioengineering Centre, moved to the Princess Margaret Rose Hospital in 1965, and the following year a self-care unit was built. This building meant that the 60 child patients and their families who travelled to Edinburgh from all over Scotland now had accommodation when receiving treatment. And now I'm going to talk a bit about their patient experience. All of the patients at the Bioengineering Centre had their artificial limbs handmade for them and usually received treatment from an extremely young age until they were adults. This is critical to the patient's sense of identity because it meant that their artificial limbs were an extension of themselves, changing with them as they grew and aged. As well as receiving support from bioengineers, the children also undertook intensive training with occupational therapists who taught them how to use their artificial limb. These training sessions typically lasted between 1 and 2 weeks, and the patients often bonded with one another because as many as 5 families stayed in the self-care unit at one time. Significantly, occupational therapists consistently encourage the children to be independent by teaching them how to use their feet for tasks like eating or playing, as can be seen in this photograph, and how to use modified clothing to go to the bathroom independently. And this photograph here was actually modified clothing that was made by an occupational therapist at the hospital. And the way this would work is you would attach hooks to your wall, and the child would attach the straps to the wall and step out of their underwear and then step back in later on, because they didn't have any other way of doing it. This is particularly interesting considering many contemporary medical professionals involved with the bioengineering department expressed concern that using feet for daily activities could cause long-term strains on the patient's back and hips. This free choice of the children to decide whether they wanted to wear prostheses or not, along with the measures put in place to enable them to do daily tasks unaided, signifies that advancements in bioengineering and occupational therapy allowed children with physical disabilities to have choice in navigating their disabled status on their own terms. However, many child patients found that wearing a prosthesis had a positive impact on their lives. For example, David Gow, a bioengineer at the Princess Margaret Rose Hospital, stated that many patients could adapt to their prosthesis very quickly and actually grew to love their artificial limb, as the prosthesis made it possible for some of the patients to attend mainstream school. Therefore, through looking at the origins of the bioengineering centre and its first patients, historians can realise that wearing a prosthesis from a young age could have a meaningful influence on a child's sense of self and their experiences in education, but some children might have chosen not to wear prostheses for the same reasons. This highlights that during the 1960s, the bioengineering sector in Edinburgh recognised the value of autonomy for those with physical disabilities, regardless of age. And now I'm going to talk about something called Cosmesis. Cosmesis refers to the cosmetic coverings that are placed over an artificial limb. When the bioengineering centre was opened in the 1960s, cosmetic coverings were made using PVC, which wasn't very durable. The coverings had to be replaced every 3 months because they got dirty so easily that newspaper print transferred onto the fingers. This meant that those who used artificial limbs during this period often had different prostheses for different occasions. Some would wear a cosmetic prosthesis for special events, like this one. So the one at the top doesn't actually move, it's just passive. While wear a more functional gas or water powered prosthesis with exposed mechanisms, like the one at the bottom, at work or home. While this illustrates that those with physical disabilities had a variety of prosthesis types readily available to them during the 1960s and 1970s, it also suggests that this choice might have been perhaps undermined by societal expectations on what the human body should look like. Prosthesis users might have felt social pressure to wear a cosmetic covering around those who did not use prosthesis, again suggesting that those with physical disabilities may have felt isolated or misunderstood. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, the Bioengineering Centre achieved international acclaim for developing some of the first ever cosmetic coverings with silicone. These lasted much longer than their PVC predecessor. They were replaced every 10 months, which meant much less hospital visits for the patients, and because of a vigorous colour mixing technique, it was possible to get a closer skin match. Studies carried out by the centre during this time highlight that many users welcomed advancements in cosmesis and expressed happiness when friends and relatives liked the look of their cosmetic gloves, which can be seen in this report, which came from the centre in the 1980s. Therefore, it is important to consider that some people with physical disabilities may not have felt forced to wear cosmetically realistic prostheses, but rather chose to because they personally wanted their artificial limb to look realistic. This highlights the multifaceted nature of the identities and desires of disabled people, and as historians it is important for us to try and document this diversity. In recent years, artificial limbs have become increasingly personalised, not just in terms of more exact matching skin colour, but are also being used as wearable art pieces that are crafted to tailor to the user's personal interests. For example, in 2008, Touch Bionics, a company based in Livingston, West Lothian, acquired the American cosmetic covering company Livingskin, and since then the company has offered a service where they create bespoke designs for their customers. These custom-made prosthetic coverings are often made with the intention to look bionic or robotic, with an emphasis on black or transparent fingers and exposed mechanisms, or sci-fi designs, like you can see here. This service, at its high cost and unavailability on health bodies like the NHS, is inaccessible to the vast majority of the disabled community. However, the emergence of this bionic look illustrates that modern prostheses are increasingly being used to express the user's sense of fashion, taste and personality. Therefore, the expanding market of custom-made cosmetic coverings can give us some insight into the future of the bioengineering industry, and what this might mean for those who will benefit from this change. So I'm just going to wrap up now. In conclusion, this paper has given a brief history of the bioengineering sector in Edinburgh, from the First World War until the present day. It has displayed the vast range of experiences and identities of those with physical disabilities who use artificial limbs. It has demonstrated that when prostheses are used and worn, whether cosmetic coverings were used, can inform historians about the technological and social context in which disabled people lived, as well as allowing us to understand more about their daily experiences. Furthermore, it has stressed the importance of including the decision by some disabled people to not wear artificial limbs when documenting this history. This paper has also illustrated the vibrancy of the David Gow Bioengineering Collection at the Lothian Health Services Archive, and I hope that this encourages further research into the collection and the area more generally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Again, a lot to think about cyborgs, actually, and kind of integrating other parts into kind of yourself, but also the formation of group identities of uses of artificial limbs. The next paper is going to be presented by Danielle Alove from the University of York, where Danielle is a student in English and history with a particular interest in Russian history. And now she's going to talk to us about Alexander Pushkin and blackness, family fiction, and national history.
So Alexander Pushkin is often considered to be the modern father of Russian literature. Pushkin was descendant of Abram Petrovich Ganibal, an African slave who was kidnapped as a child and gifted to Peter the Great. Ganibal rose to great prominence, achieving success in the military, engineering, and governance. Pushkin turned to the events of his great-grandfather's life for inspiration in his creative works on numerous occasions. Written during a period of internal exile, Pushkin's unfinished historical novel, The Blackamoor of Peter the Great, is his most extended treatment on blackness in Russia. It was also his first sustained attempt at prose. Over 6 completed chapters, Pushkin delivers a fictionalized account of his ancestors' time in both Russia and France in the early 18th century. The remaining chapters were published posthumously after the poet died from a wound from a duel in 1837. The novel's title was an editor's creation. So the novel focuses on Ibrahim, a fictionalized version of Ganibal. Ibrahim is sent to France to receive an education, and whilst he is in Paris, he has an affair with a married countess. The countess becomes the target of society gossip when she falls pregnant, and bets the maid as to whether her child will be black. The countess gives birth to a black baby, but their child is sent away and replaced with another newborn in order to trick the count. The heartbreak that this incident causes, alongside a letter from Peter, prompts Ibrahim to return to Russia to help the Tsar with his reforms. In Russia, Peter arranges a marriage for Ibrahim, matching his godson with the daughter of an old noble family. The daughter is reluctant to marry, and then the text breaks off at this moment. In an essay most likely written in 1835, Pushkin wrote, "The Byron family is one of the most ancient in the English aristocracy. Its name is mentioned with honour in the English chronicles. For David and Bethia, the Pushkins, just like the Byrons, had a history and belonged to history. The reference to the English chronicles suggests that this belonging is facilitated by the act of being written into history, for a chronicle is a written account. It also suggests that for the Byrons, family history is national history. In the instance of Ganibal and the Pushkins, however, as suggested by the poem in 1825, the same cannot be said. In a note to the first chapter of Yevgeny Onegin, Pushkin states that the strange life of Ganibal is known only from family legends in Russia, where the memory of remarkable people vanishes because of the lack of historical notes. In time, we hope to publish a full biography. This note then suggests that an individual's relationship to history is mediated by written materials. However, instead of publishing a biography, Pushkin set out to write a historical novel. The Blackamoor of Peter the Great can then be seen as an attempt by Pushkin to write his great-grandfather into Russian history. In Catherine Pomansky's understanding of the note in Onegin, the example of Ganibal draws attention to the developing understanding of Russia as a historical nation in the Western European sense of time. The increasing popularity of historical fiction in Russia by authors such as Sir Walter Scott also encouraged further reflection on the connection between Russian history and Europe. With its dual settings of Paris and St. Petersburg, the Blackamoor deals with both Russian and European history. The historical novel as a genre helped to shape national identity. For Russia, this self-defining took place in relationship with Europe. In choosing to centre the narrative on a fictionalised version of Ganibal, Pushkin inscribes blackness into Russian national identity. Fiction, rather than biography, provided Pushkin with the opportunity to use certain representational strategies to associate his ancestor with Peter the Great and his reforms. A traditional biography would have started by recounting Abraham's childhood in Africa, but Pushkin's novel opens in media res. Among the young men sent abroad by Peter the Great to acquire the knowledge necessary for the reformed state was his godson, the Moor Ibrahim. This sentence then works to identify Ibrahim as not only as close to the Tsar as his godson, but also as participating in Peter's reforms. Ibrahim is historicised by taking part in these reforms, and it's also as if Ibrahim's history starts at the moment when he's involved in this formative period of Russian history. Details of Ibrahim's childhood in Africa are communicated by Ibrahim's future father-in-law, Revsky. Members of the Revsky family object to Peter playing matchmaker, countering the claim that Natasha will marry a blackamoor. Revsky states that Ibrahim has noble origins. However, this is dismissed as folklore by the rest of the family. Recollections of Ibrahim's youth are associated with Peter the Great. Upon returning to Russia, Ibrahim has dinner with the imperial family. During the meal, Peter recalled some features of Ibrahim's childhood and recounted them with such mirth and good nature. The events of Ibrahim's childhood in Africa are dismissed in the novel as fiction, but his childhood in Russia is legitimised through the figure of Peter. The text then seeks to link Ibrahim's personal history with Russia. Before leaving France for Russia, the Duke of Orleans implores Ibrahim to remain in Paris. He says, "Russia is not your fatherland. I don't think you'll be seeing your torrid birthplace ever again, but your prolonged stay in France has made you equally alien to the climate and ways of life in half-savage Russia." The regent's comments position Ibrahim as incapable of existing within Russia. The Duke's references to climate and ways of life is reminiscent of the degeneration theory used to explain racial difference that arose to prominence in 18th and 19th century Europe. This theory presented the superiority of Europeans as a result of climate, geography, and customs. It has often been assumed that because Russia did not participate in the slave trade, it remained outside of European debates on race. Members of the Russian elite, however, could be exposed to these discourses through education abroad and also because the gentry spoke French, the language in which most of these debates took place. It is also likely that Pushkin, a member of the aristocracy and fluent in French, would have been acquainted with these debates on race. In writing about his black ancestor, Pushkin also had to contend with the contemporary debates and cultural assumptions about race. The opening pages of the novel reveal that Ibrahim frequents the same Parisian salons as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Fontenelle, all who were involved in debates regarding race and history. Ibrahim also reflects on his African origins. Considering Peter's offers to arrange his marriage to Natasha, Ibrahim asks himself, to marry, why not? Can I be destined to spend my life in solitude because I was born below the 15th parallel? This is reminiscent of the question he poses in his farewell letter to the Countess. Why strive to unite the destiny of so delicate, so beautiful a being with the wretched destiny of a Negro, a pitiful creature barely worthy to be called human? In his self-evaluation, Ibrahim positions himself on the margins of humanity because of his blackness. Both questions precede moments in the text where Ibrahim commits himself to Russia. After the latter, he sets out to Russia, and in the former, he agrees to marry Revsky's daughter. Marriage is the vehicle that will legitimize his Russian identity. Ibrahim himself recognizes this, stating, "Marriage to Revsky's daughter will connect me with the proud Russian nobility, and I will stop being a stranger in my new fatherland." After hearing Peter's offer, Ibrahim's initial response suggests that he views his appearance as an obstacle to his union with Natasha. Ibrahim's friend and foe, Korsakov, links Ibrahim's appearance with an unhappy marriage. He cautions Ibrahim, saying, "With your ardent, brooding, and suspicious character, with your flattened nose, puffy lips, and that mop of wool, rush into all dangers of marriage." Korsakov's essentializing dialogue suggests that marriage will not be the mechanism by which Ibrahim will achieve national belonging. Sarah Yoon has read The Blackamoor of Peter the Great as a creation myth. Reading the novel within this mythic framework, Peter can be viewed as analogous with God and Ibrahim with Abraham. In Genesis, God promises to multiply Abraham's seed, and Peter arranges his godson's marriage to overcome the fact that Ibrahim is without kith or kin. Pushkin's plans for the rest of the narrative, however, render Peter's aims unlikely. According to Voloff, the plot would progress and feature the infidelity of Abraham's wife and the birth of an illegitimate white baby. Korsakov jokes about Abraham rocking another man's baby, and the revival of Natasha's former love interest in the fragment of Chapter 7 hints at this plot. Unlike in his fictional account, Gannibal's marriage was not arranged by the Tsar, and his first wife was not a member of the boyar class. Many critics have interpreted Pushkin's deviation from historical facts, keeping within the spirit of Peter's reforms, the creation of a new class based on servant personal merit rather than ancestry. The infidelity of Ibrahim's wife does, however, align with Gannibal's biography. The Blackamoor of Peter the Great works to associate Ibrahim with Peter the Great in his forms. This association presents Ibrahim as involved in shaping nationhood and writes him into Russian history and identity. To be written into history, however, elements of his past must be suppressed. The incomplete novel's potential plot also suggests that Ibrahim will remain an outsider. Perhaps the tension between belonging to history but existing outside of a community are why Pushkin abandoned the novel. However, in his first sustained attempt at prose, Pushkin merged family and national history to create a discourse in Russian history that includes blackness.
Thank you very much for taking us. Whoop. Oh, I knew that this would. Sorry. For taking us back to Russia in the 18th and 19th century, and kind of questions around blackness and whiteness and Russian identity, and Pushkin's maybe intentional kind of attempt at integrating blackness into Russian identity, right? Which I find absolutely fascinating. And now on to our last paper for this session, and that will be presented to us by Gabriel Couto Ribas. Who comes to us from Greenwich University in London and comes from Brazil. Gabriel is studying sociology and psychology, and will talk to us about he will present an autoethnography of doing drag and what that means for questions around identification. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Benno. Thank you so much, Claire and Olivia. It's been an incredible day. A little bit intimidating, not gonna lie. We spent such a fantastic day looking at, historical accounts and reflections. And I'm just rolling up here. I'm gonna talk about myself.
I'm sorry, could you put the microphone a bit closer to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Fantastic. So, I wrote this paper about my relationship with drag and how it shaped who I am today. And in fact, you can see me in the far right of the picture in drag. The only time you'll see me at the far right of anything. So my history with drag started 10 years ago. I still remember very vividly, to this day, the very first contact. I was 10 years old. I was just flicking through the channels until I stumbled upon this ad for a reality TV show called RuPaul's Drag Race. Thank you. Called RuPaul's Drag Race. In this show, drag queens compete in dancing, showing acting skills. And I didn't really fully understand what was going on. When I looked at it, I didn't understand the intention. But one thing felt certain. From that very moment up until now, I feel a growing fascination with drag. And I believe that much of who I am today stems from what drag taught me. The strength I had to tap into when I felt lost, the resilience that I have built in the face of discrimination. I owe much of my identity to drag culture. And I believe my obsession with drag is due to how subversive it is. We live in a society where gender norms are not unlike laws, and any diversion from these norms is socially punished. And that happens even more violently in countries such as Brazil. It is transgressive to blur these gender lines, held almost to a sacred status. And it fascinated me to see how drag owns this aspect of this art form so fearlessly. Naturally, at 14, I was not able to come to that conclusion with as much clarity as today. But as a gay boy coming to terms with my own sexuality, already facing discrimination at home and at school, seeing drag queens poking fun at the very rules that were being used as weapons against me was nothing short of exhilarating. I was never an outspoken child, and throughout my shy early teen years, I was in a constant battle with myself and who I thought I was supposed to be. And I see this relating to Judge Herbert Mead's ideas. He was an American psychologist writing in the early 20th century about the development of the self. He states that we have two selves, the me, which is based in what we think others think of us, and the I, which is based on our actual impulses, desires, and feelings. And at 14, as I was struggling to figure out how to fit the mold for what I thought others expected me to be, and my ideas around who I was were always in relation to how I thought others would perceive me. A couple of pictures from me back then. Not my proudest moment, hairstyle-wise. Dark times. And as I was growing older, I was starting to realize that I was different from everyone I knew, and I had to face the fact I would be unable to hide this. I would be unable to be the macho footballer my dad wanted me to be. I wouldn't bring a daughter-in-law for him to meet. And I had to make peace with the fact that I would not be satisfying those expectations, and that brought me a great deal of pain. I was unable to fit those modes. I was incapable of performing the only role that I thought it was acceptable for me to engage with. But then something changed, and you were seeing drag queens on TV talking about the same struggles, how they overcame them, and how they were living their lives through the narratives that they wrote for themselves that it clicked. It was not that I was unable to fulfill those expectations. I was unwilling to do so. And I'd find it very challenging to express in words how much this realization changed my outlook in life. Because from that moment on, I could start considering myself as I, Mead's unapologetic, impulsive I. My identity no longer a handicap or a defect, but a source of pride and strength. And the passion that I have since then nurtured for drag was only heightened once I was old enough to attend drag shows in São Paulo's bustling LGBT scene. And I could befriend some of the drag artists and get a glimpse for the struggles and the glories of what it is to be a drag performer in a sexist and homophobic Latin American country. And I also got to experience the power of drag by doing it myself, something I had dreamed of doing for years. And it is life-changing to feel that transgressive, that deviant, to purposefully cause discomfort, and to unsettle people by exposing how fragile gender norms are. And this got me thinking about drag through Judith Butler's perspective, one of the biggest names in gender studies. She saw gender as being a performance, not as something we are, but as something we do. And for me, to do drag is to pull the curtains of the gender stage, forcing people to see how none of it is real. And by that I mean none of this is natural or innate. One is socializing to these modes. And only through this understanding that I believe one is able to really envision who they want to be. And this transformative aspect of drag makes it a powerful tool that has been and should continue being appropriated by the LGBT community in our strides towards acceptance and recognition. There is a historical, political, and cultural relevance to drag that must be highlighted. I don't think I could ever talk about drag and the importance of drag without talking about Stonewall. So here in the top left corner, we see self-identified drag queens, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were among the leading forces of the Stonewall riots. And 40 years later, barely 2 miles away from the actual Stonewall win, Bob the drag queen was being arrested whilst protesting for marriage equality. And more recently in Brazil, in the 2016, days before the 2016 election, we had Pablo Vittar in a televised performance screaming the popular chant of opposition that we had at the time against Bolsonaro, not him. And in the nightlife, where we see the more grittier and the purest form of drag, we also saw some protest against ex-president Michel Temer. We have there Milana with the words "Out with Temer" written. And I don't believe these are just individuals who happen to be artists using their platform to promote their political views. I think there's something deeper going on here. I think these examples illustrate the instrumentalization of drag as a tool of resistance, weaponizing the art form for advocate for social change. Therefore, it becomes evident how drag has served a political purpose in rewriting the narratives that have been written about the LGBT community. And it must be recognized for both its historical significance and its undeniable potential to dismantle the constructs that keep the queer community marginalized in society. And the lessons I learned from drag will always be part of who I am, the passion, the defiance, the voice, the ability to not take life so seriously whenever possible, but also to never trivialize my identity and my right to exist in this world. Moreover, drag has been at the front lines of the movement that has been creating a new reality for queer people. Let's rewind. Moreover, drag has also been at the front lines of the movement that has been creating a new reality for queer people, one in which we do not have to hide. Nevertheless, we're still far from achieving complete legal recognition in the developed world, and in the developing world, this reality is even further away from people's realities. And in this process of continuing to demand equality, in this cultural battle that queer people are waging against cis heteronormativity, drag must stand as one of our most powerful tools to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for another great paper on kind of finding identity, but also using drag as a position to kind of oppose certain developments and as a means of resistance as well. So now this is kind of the magic moment. Now we're going to do the strange thing that I talked about in the beginning. I'm going to grant ourselves like 5 or a bit more minutes to kind of just engage in conversations as you're sitting with the people around you about 4 papers. We heard about Quentin Crisp, trans and queer and gay. We heard about artificial limbs in Scotland and how they kind of merge with bodies and how group identities form. We heard about Peter the Great and the great-grandfather of Alexander Pushkin and kind of merging of Black and Russian identities. And we heard about drag in Brazil and drag identities, drag performances, and how that plays out across history and across lifespans. So these are the topics you are now invited to discuss, and then we kind of reconvene and share our thoughts and comments in like 5 minutes. Okay. I'm glad to see that this obviously that was exactly what I was hoping for, kind of buzz. So thanks for that. But still, I want you to give us the chance to share some of the things you've just been discussing and talking about. So now this is the time for comments, questions you want to share with the panelists, but also with the other members of the audience. Yes, thank you very much. You like over there, please.
Hi, they were all really interesting talks. I just have a question for Gabriel. It was an amazing talk. We were just discussing, I was thinking about drag and about RuPaul's Drag Race and just kind of discourses surrounding that. You brought up Butler, who in Bodies That Matter talks about drag and mentions Bell Hooks, who, I don't agree with this, just to point out, but calls drag misogynistic. In its kind of parody of, but also exclusion of women, which I don't agree with. But I just think it's an interesting kind of concept. And we were thinking about RuPaul and his recent comments about excluding trans women from Drag Race, and also the fact that there's never any kind of bio women on Drag Race. And what you kind of think about this, because although Drag Race is kind of an amazing way of bringing drag to the mainstream, it also arguably also erases kind of the history of it and kind of the struggles of like the ballroom culture it comes from, and how RuPaul kind of doesn't fully unpack or like give credit to that. Sorry, that's quite a long question, but
no, thank you so much. Yeah, that's really, really important to note. At the same time that Drag Race has been so incredible for not only the drag, but also the queer community in general. It's also really important to note how it's not the end-all be-all of drag, and the kind of drag represented there. It's not 1% of what drag can be. It actually is in real spaces. So, and also it's good to remember it's a TV show. It's meant to be for entertainment purposes. So I think, although it's great what it brought to the community, it also needs to be taken with a grain of salt to a lot of extents. And we shouldn't also idolize RuPaul if we can avoid this, one thing is to be grateful for the impact that she's had, and we should also remain critical of what she has been saying or doing. I think it relates back to one of the points that were mentioned in the previous panels about we shouldn't really treat people as either heroes or villains. We should see them as humans, Even
RuPaul. Other comments and questions? Yes, over here, please.
I'm sorry, I could have waited till you were back in this chair. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much. There were 4 really fascinating papers about what we think of ourselves and how we imagine identity to be. It caused us to having some really interesting conversations about our own identities and and kind of Britishness as well, because we're actually both from Scotland and Wales, and what that means to being British. I just wanted to, was it Piers? Yeah. Thank you so much for your paper on Quentin Crisp, because I had always heard of her as using male pronouns, and because I think, and I was kind of going from Gabriel's point, the point that we'd all kind of laboured in the last, we like to apply kind of hero or villain. I'd always heard of Quentin as a kind of villainous, pompous, like male, old. I don't mean this. Like old gay was the term, and I wondered. I think it's been so fascinating for you to bring this here and see what it does about it. Did you find her when you apply female pronouns to as they identified? Did you find that did it change your outlook on Quentin Crisp as a person? Did it find that when you re-examine their own history, her own history, does it give you an opportunity to kind of reevaluate your own perceptions of her, or as potentially queer community's perceptions of her as a person? Thank you.
No, that's a brilliant question. I mean, it was one I knew would come up in some way. And yeah, I'm glad that somebody's heard about some of these discussions about her. I mean, first of all, I think using whatever pronouns for her, I don't think she would have cared at all. I mean, I was watching a documentary last night, and apparently in her will it said she actually specifically requested that her ashes be put in the garbage can. That's a quote, which Philip Ward, her executor, did not do in the end, but this is the kind of person. Anyway, so, yeah, I mean, there definitely is an image of her as a kind of an old school gay, and that is absolutely kind of what that gender dimension. I think it's about unpacking what that means, and what that seems to mean to me for a lot of people, and what's reflected in that part of that letter from Gay News that I quoted, is that people had a perception that this was the wrong way forward, that sexuality was completely separate from gender, and that being, effeminate and ridiculous in all these kinds of ways is the bad thing that straight people are against. I mean, there's people like Peter Tatchell as well, who's always been very anti-Quentin Crisp and talks about her in a very derisory way. I mean, not that it's not not that it's a straightforward issue, because if you want a list of problematic things that Quentin Crisp has said, they're kind of yes, absolutely, yeah. But no, I mean, pronouns, that's changing my outlook. I mean, that's the idea of using the different pronouns, is to start just thinking, this is clearly a kind of identity that she lived in the interwar period, which doesn't match one's today, and thus it overlaps with several that exist today. So that means, as a gay person, you could, as a gay man, you could find inspiration from him, and I think exactly equally, if you're a trans woman, you could say she was also a wonderful inspiration and kind of a hero. I mean, I didn't unpack the kind of hero worship elements of all of this, but I think it's the pronouns is a really important way of changing that outlook and kind of revising how we see these kinds of people.
Thank you. Although you had the 3 big stars on the screen. Other comments and questions? Sorry, we're changing sides again. Yeah, but it's up there. But no need to rush. We're absolutely fine with time.
Hi. I really enjoyed all of the panelists speak once again. And sort of my question's kind of following on from that, but sort of more generally to the panel as well. So, like, for example, as a queer woman myself, like, it sort of prompted my own sort of interest in queer history as a way of like understanding my own identity, and I think that's something that's been reflected a lot during the day. So I was wondering for sort of the panelists in general, when it comes to these ideas of shifting identity, how do you kind of grapple with the fact that you're kind of learning and discovering things in your research, either about something that is personally important to you or may have been personally important to someone you know, or whatever has sparked your interest, even if it's not personal identity, but for those it is personal identity, like how do you think that history has that role in changing and helping people?
Now that raises the question, who wants to go first with talking about what personal identities mean for the research you're doing? Any kind of volunteers?
Sorry, it was me again. I mean, that was clearly, you could probably tell that was well, maybe not, but that was a big part of my reason for researching Quentin Crisp was, having seen The Naked Civil Servant as a teenager somehow and finding it really wonderful and fascinating, but kind of confusing and odd as well. And yeah, I think we've all everyone here today has kind of had this navigating their own identity through their research, and I think history, even when it's kind of the bad stuff, is doing that. Like you mentioned with Macaulay, like even somebody like him is navigating like English national identity through the kinds of things he's writing. So it doesn't have to be necessarily something which only reflects a kind of positive kind of history. It's just something which happens in history, is that the person who is researching it is always there, and they're always sort of negotiating their sense of self through their topic. That's all I had to contribute to that, but there might be more.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot speak from the perspective of history, being from another field, but I think when you're studying something that deeply relates to your history, I think there's something quite special in that. At the same time that you need to remain critical and you need to remain, it's really easy with sociological autobiographies, for instance, to engage in self-indulgence, as it's called. And that kind of perspectives. But at the same time, this is one of the areas where you can really care for what you're doing, is when you do something that's deeply related to your history and the history of your people. So I think that's really important.
Do you also want to share some thoughts on that, please?
I don't know if my answers will be as good as this. So, pretty much the same as these guys. My research was kind of inspired by my own identity. I identify as a disabled person. So I'm autistic, and I feel as though being autistic, especially as an autistic woman, there's a lot of boxes that you don't tend to fit in this idea of autism. And I feel that that's often the case with people with artificial limbs as well, as they don't fit into this mainstream society that people want them to fit in. So that's why I thought that this was a job for me that I applied for, and I was like, this sounds perfect. And I feel like history, like with personal history as well, like my dream job is in museums, and the whole point for that is you just want to see things in a building that relate to you. Like if the past doesn't represent you, then who does it represent? If that makes sense. So I hope that's a good enough answer.
Well, I'm not Russian, so there's some distance there. But I really do, but I do enjoy Russian literature, and I didn't think of a way of like introducing blackness until I learned about this biographical detail of Pushkin's, and I think like looking at sort of my own like identity and putting that into the research that I do was a way into Russian history that I didn't think about beforehand. So I think there's that.
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments, remarks, interventions, critiques? Now we move on to the right-hand side again.
I just had a question for Carmen, because something that came through really strongly in your presentation was this idea that people could find their own way of doing something that some of us might see as quite generic. So an artificial limb we might all think is sort of not quite one size fits all, but there's one way of doing it. And you were talking about the ways that people found their own nuance to that, which I thought was really interesting. And based on the stuff we were saying about microhistories earlier, do you think there are ways of making it more individual now, making the history we look at more individual, and highlighting those individuals and the ways in which they found to navigate their disability?
That's a really good question. I didn't actually have time to talk about that sort of stuff, but there was actually a couple of individual stories that I looked at in my research. And a problem with writing about this is a lot of the time, if these artificial limbs aren't given to someone because of birth issues, birth deformities, they also come from trauma. So there was a story of a man who actually lost both legs in a rock climbing accident, in which his best friend died as well. That I spoke about. And he, even today, he still wants to climb mountains, even though he has no legs. And there's a lot of, he has to work with the bioengineers at this centre today to get the best artificial legs available to him so that he can still do everything he wants to do. And apparently even at his local gym he's always outrunning everybody else. So I think these kind of stories are really important to bring to light, because it shows the adversity that disabled people face, and that they just kind of keep marching on as well. Because I feel like the fact that disabled people are silenced takes away from the fact that they do just act like you and me, they just act like everyday people, and they just do great things no matter what. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course you can.
Holding it. I had a question for Danielle. I was just wondering, how do you kind of see Pushkin represented in Russian society today, or with kind of key, maybe Russian politicians or figures? Because we've spoken about how blackness is seen today within the historical discipline in Britain, especially in parts in America. So I was wondering if you knew about the movements today.
I can't exactly speak for like contemporary Russia, but I know during the Soviet Union period that Pushkin's blackness was known about, and it was sort of celebrated and was kind of used as a talking point to compare the Soviet Union with America and say, oh yeah, we accept black people here because, you know, our founding father of our literature was black. And that also when students from, say, Africa came to the Soviet Union to sort of, for like educational purposes, when there was, like, say, discrimination that they faced there, they also referenced Pushkin again, saying, oh, we are like the descendants of Pushkin, so you can't discriminate against us on these grounds, stuff like that. So I think that sort of, like, blackness is important in discussions with Russia because they use it as a way to, like, sort of navigate the world with relations with America or other Western powers, and then they continue to use that blackness as a, like, a talking point. Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you. Yes. Because if not, then I would kind of I wanted to share what we've been discussing because when everybody's been talking, we talked about kind of the permanency or kind of the changeability of identities, which I think kind of is one of the things, right? Usually we tend to think about identity as something we have, and we have it for good, but it's obviously not true, which conversation ended in a discussion about age, because age is kind of, that seems to be the category that has, or one of the categories maybe, that has that changeability written into it, right? Where kind of, it's kind of always assumed that you go kind of to the next stage, whatever the next stage is. So that was one I found very interesting kind of conversation about identity, and how it changes across biographical lifespan, but also historically across time. The question that I wanted to bring up for all panelists, if I may, is about identity politics, and how that maybe changes our understanding of center and margin. I know it's a very general question, but so we've been talking about trans identities, gay identities, queer identities, the formation of kind of group identities of disabled people, but also questions around kind of passing as able-bodied, kind of these, and Russian national identities, blackness. So I mean that it seems to be built into that politics of bringing kind of the margins closer to the center, right? But what does it actually do? So does that kind of lead those different marginal positions ever closer towards a central position that is imagined as kind of having an infinite potential for inclusion? Or does that diversify positions so that kind of the center kind of is blurred and disappears? I said, I know it's a very big question, but kind of from the different kinds of questions you are dealing with, do you have any thoughts about that? This kind of identity politics as a way of kind of giving voice to groups of people at the margins, what that does kind of in the as it were kind of larger scheme of things. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
I believe that identity politics, it helps us understand exactly what kind of different histories there are within those marginalized histories, and I think her goal with giving more visibility to those different identities, how they intersect and how those different oppressions combine, is a crucial step for us to not get the marginalized positions closer to the center, but not to have a center at all. The center can only exist if there is a margin. I don't think that's something that we should strive for. So I believe, that would be the purpose of identity politics.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and huge. So I think I probably can't quite deal with it at that level. But I would say, well, like in terms of Quentin Crisp, there is a really interesting negotiation with politics. Like we saw that maybe a bit. I touched on it with the idea of like moving away from or feeling like alienated from gay liberation. In a way, you'd think, you know, it's somebody who you know has an identity like that would definitely be on board with this, you know, the kind of post-Stonewall moment. But clearly, you see the kind of internal exclusionary trajectories that happened there. And what that means actually is you have somebody like Quentin who in the 20s and 30s did have a kind of militant, this is who I am, I will dress however I like and go wherever I like, no matter what anyone does or says, attitude, and you know, which could be seen as a very strong identity politic, but which then she, as she gets older, age again, she seems to go, that's just a youthful kind of thing which I can leave behind, and now politics is done. I don't know if that contributes much, but it's just trying to think about, you know, identity politics in the past.
And in a more complicated way, right, than that kind of easy, in the end, everybody's going to be in the center. Did you also have thoughts about kind of identity politics and kind of the histories we write and what kind of effects they have politically?
In terms of like Pushkin's great-grandfather and blackness in Russia, I think it sort of raises more questions about like the project of making an empire, because by like positioning a black person involved in these reforms to sort of make a Russian empire, it sort of raises more questions where you consider blackness would be separate from this, and also that if blackness is involved in making empires, then like how does that, instead of being like sort of the subjugated, like the people who have been colonized, instead of being involved in the actual like sort of subjugation, like how does that work out? And I think in Russia sort of need to look into that more.
I don't know if I have very much to contribute again, to be honest. But another thing I didn't have time for was there was actually a story, basically when they realised that thalidomide was the cause of a lot of disabilities among children in the 1960s. In the UK, all of the children affected by thalidomide were given compensation. But the compensation wasn't actually enough. And there was a lady with two other people that were affected by thalidomide that actually went on hunger strike in the 1980s to kind of tell the government that they needed to do more for their disability. And I think that says a lot about how people with disabilities are willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause to help people that are like them. And I just think that's a really interesting point that should be raised. I don't know if it really contributes anything, but...
That's interesting, because that then raises the question: what is recognition and compensation, and how does a society signal inclusion? Not necessarily in the center, right? Or definitely not into the center in that case. But yeah, well, we're left with a question, right? Whether white cis middle class straight able-bodied man will continue to be the center, or whether we'll come to a position where things change more dramatically. You also had a comment and a question, right?
It kind of follows off like from what you said, and it's kind of based on blackness. So I remember a while ago I was reading, I think it was like Bell Hooks, it was someone along those lines, and they were talking about how they were leading a seminar and kind of how even though she wanted the conversation to move away from blackness under the white gaze, how it kind of came back to that. So like with Pushkin, is that how would you kind of say, would you say it's possible to reimagine, like historically reimagine ways that we can see and view blackness away from like whiteness and kind of structures such as that, or like do you think it's possible kind of at present and then within the future as well to reimagine and see blackness away from whiteness? It's a big question.
That's a really good question, and I guess in the case of this Russia, it sort of seems like whenever blackness is discussed, whiteness always comes up, and I don't know how to navigate that without sort of... It just always seems to come up, even when it always seems to come up, and I don't know how you go about like removing whiteness from the equation, because I think they're both like concepts that develop alongside each other. I don't know. I'd like to find a way to do it, but I don't know how.
Yes, there's.
This is probably another really broad question that I don't know the answer to it. But in my own research, I've been really struggling with giving labels of marginality to people that may not have identified as marginal. So for me, I'm looking at people that they haven't said that they are disabled. It's other people that have labelled them so. So how have you guys navigated that in your research, and what are your thoughts on that, basically?
Wow, now we are talking. Who wants to mislabeling people you're doing research on? Who wants to react to that? Maybe do you want to start, Carmen? Nah. Anybody else?
Well, obviously the topic was kind of about that. What was the question again?
How what are your thoughts on labeling people?
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, the labeling issue is everything I presented could be argued against as a kind of anachronism, and even using words like queer and in a certain way is wrong. What could be considered as anachronistic and wrong, it was one of the issues I had actually writing the paper, was using words like homosexual, and when I use the word homosexual, do I put that in inverted commas? Am I using that in the sense that means a certain, am I using that as a phrase that I'm using, or am I using it as a historical term? The waters are so murky with that in terms of queer history, because it's all so centred on how identities are changing across time and how people see themselves. So in terms of my own research, it's an issue where anything I write about queer history, I always feel it's inadequate because it feels it's too heavy-footed. Like it's not. There's no way you can be delicate enough to past identities to make it work fully. And yeah, maybe that came across in my talk.
Maybe I can also say something to that, because you could think, like, if you do oral history and interviews, there is no problem because you kind of get the labels people themselves use. But that is, again, based on the assumption that our kind of self-understandings are without contradictions, right? And I never believed that, because I know that, I'm full of contradictions, and usually people you talk to in oral history interviews are as well. So kind of one of the men I spoke to kind of, he would not claim to be kind of in opposition to any system. He's a very successful kind of insurance business, married, children, and then always had kind of same-sex affairs, later on lived with a young man. But he would not, as you say, he would not consider himself marginal. But of course, if I include him into my research as a gay man, that kind of troubles that. I think the main point here is probably really to try to get beyond thinking in these either-or terms, right? They are important for certain kind of strategic political statements and interventions, but they are never good enough to grasp reality, I think, if that makes sense. Did anybody else want to? Now we have...
It seems to me that in a wonderful utopian world, we wouldn't need forms when you apply to university which say, what's your gender, what's your sex, what's your ethnicity. If only we could reach that stage where, I'm not saying your identity doesn't matter, but everybody's identity is different. There's no such thing as a gay man. Every gay man is slightly different from any other gay man, who is slightly different from every heterosexual man, and so on and so on. Your identity matters to you, but wouldn't it be great if we could reach a state where it didn't matter at all what colour you were, what religion you were, what ethnicity, what sexuality, whatever. You stood an equal chance of opportunity. You stood an equal chance of being supported by the state if you needed an artificial limb, whatever it be. And the only hope of us ever reaching that is if we understand as much as possible about other people. And that's what everybody's been talking about. If we don't have history, study of people from all across the spectrum, all across the different spectrum, we'll never understand everybody. And if we don't understand people, we'll always regard somebody as being other from the group that I'm in. So it's not really a question, it's just an observation that the study of marginal history is very important, simply because it hasn't been done. Mainstream history has studied a mainstream group. In the old days, it used to be kings and emperors. It's broadened out these days, and it's broadening more now, and the broader it goes, the better, and the better chance we have of ending up with a completely equitable society, if only.
Okay.
Well, the thing about that is, yes, of course you're right, this is the dream, but the marginal histories have come out of patterns of power and discrimination and inequality. I mean, that's why these identities have emerged.
Absolutely. And that's why
in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And until there are real attacks on until those structures change.
Absolutely.
So the identities are always in relation to the historical structures in which we live. I mean, they're not simply, what we choose to be. They're how we're positioned in the world, what stories are being told about the kinds of people we are as compared with other kinds of people. And, I mean, I completely agree with you in making the point about identity never being fixed. Identity is a state of becoming as well as a state of being, and it changes. But one of the problems then, I think, about identity politics is the danger that these identities do seem fixed when they're not, or they shouldn't be. And when they become very fixed, they can become hierarchical, they can become divisive, and the remembering that we're all human can become, what gets lost in the struggle over whose identities are going to be the ones that have the most salience. Who's the most important? Whose voice is going to be heard? Who gets into the loos? Who controls the meetings, etc., etc.? I mean, we see it all around us, unfortunately, being enacted in ways that can be terribly divisive, unfortunately.
So these were already kind of almost concluding remarks about kind of emphasizing an infinite range of small differences, but at the same time kind of not losing sight of the big, large-scale structural discriminations. But I don't want to kind of give over to the real concluding final remarks of the conference organizers before I hadn't given you a chance to kind of have a last word if you want to have one. Anybody wants to have... Yeah.
It was just a quick thing about the identitylessness idea, which, I mean, I think there's kind of a subtle... Well, there is a difference between kind of all identities not mattering or everyone not really having an identity in the same way. But I just wanted to note from my research, it's interesting that the discourse of having no identity and it not mattering in terms of gay liberation in the 1970s was often paradoxically the thing which was very anti Quentin Crisp in the sense of that older way of thinking about homosexuality, which was about gender expression. They saw that as being kind of mimicking or reenacting power dynamics which are heterosexual dynamics, which are supposedly the kind of oppressive forms across society. So I feel like it's interesting that you just mentioned this idea of immediately you jump to and you go, sounds wonderful, this identity not mattering in a way and everyone understanding each other, but it's just interesting that I'd heard that very same discourse which actually had quite an exclusionary kind of force behind it.
Anybody else? If not, I would thank you very much for wonderful papers. Thanks for the discussion. And over to Claire and Olivia.